The night of October 6th, 1976. Beijing had become the stage for a perfectly orchestrated betrayal. 27 days had passed since the death of Mao Zedong, and the four heirs he had personally chosen to continue his revolution were about to be eliminated in a single night. Wang Hongwen, the 41-year-old man Mao had considered his successor, walked confidently toward Reading Room 119 in Zhongnanhai. He believed he was attending a routine Politburo meeting. He did not know he was crossing the threshold into his own destruction. Within the next 2 hours, he and the other 3 members of the Gang of Four would be arrested, tried in secret, and erased from the history of China. This is the story of the most silent and effective coup d'etat of the 20th century, a story of betrayal, absolute power, and how a regime devours its own organs to survive. But before you can understand how they fell, you need to understand who these 4 people were and why Mao chose them. Because what happened that night was not a simple political arrest. It was the end of an era, the brutal closure of the Cultural Revolution, and the birth of the modern China we know today. The Gang of Four was composed of the most powerful people in China after Mao himself. Jiang, the great helmsman's widow, a former Shanghai actress who had transformed herself into the most feared woman in the country. Zhang Chunqiao, the silent theorist, the ideological brain who designed purges with surgical precision. Yao Wenyuan, the propagandist who controlled every word published in China, the man who could destroy reputations with a single article. And Wang Hongwen, the youngest, Mao's favorite, a factory worker who had risen to become vice president of the Communist Party at just 38 years old. These 4 were not mere officials. They were the architects of the Cultural Revolution, the movement that between 1966 and 1976 plunged China into chaos, caused millions of deaths, destroyed the educational system, and turned the country into a vast camp of ideological re-education. They represented the radical left, those who believed the revolution had to be permanent, that class struggle could never end, that anyone who spoke of stability or economic development was a bourgeois traitor deserving to be purged. Their objective was not ideological, it was survival. They understood perfectly that if the revolution ended, they, its architects, would be the first to be judged. Wang Hongwen was the most fascinating element of the quartet. Unlike his intellectual and bureaucratic companions, Wang came genuinely from the working class. He had worked in a cotton factory in Shanghai, and during the chaos of the Cultural Revolution, he demonstrated a natural ability to organize and mobilize the masses. He became the leader of the rebel movement in Shanghai, directing millions of young Red Guards through the streets. Mao saw in Wang something he could not find in the party veterans: energy, ideological purity, and above all, blind loyalty. In 1973, Mao did something extraordinary. He elevated Wang Hongwen to the post of vice president of the Communist Party, making him the 3rd most powerful man in China, behind only himself and Premier Zhou Enlai. Wang was 38 years old. To understand the magnitude of this, imagine a head of state naming a 38-year-old factory worker as their direct successor, above every general, minister, and veteran politician in the country. That is exactly what Mao did. The photographs of that period show Wang smiling beside Mao at official parades. The message was clear to all of China and to the world. This young worker was the future of the nation. But this meteoric rise generated something predictable: massive envy and resentment. The generals who had fought in the Civil War, the bureaucrats who had spent decades building the machinery of the state, all of them saw Wang as an upstart without experience, a leader whose only skill was inciting revolutionary violence. And they were right. Wang knew nothing of administration, economics, or diplomacy. His only talent was mobilizing masses to destroy the party's enemies. This was his fatal flaw, and it would become his sentence. The year 1976 was what the Chinese would later call the year of 3 deaths. In January, Zhou Enlai died, the premier who had served as a necessary counterweight to the radicals' excesses. In July, Marshal Jude died, one of the founding fathers of the People's Liberation Army. And on September 9, 1976, Mao Zedong finally died. Mao's death was not just the end of a man, it was the end of an era, and it opened Pandora's box of succession. In his final months, Mao had made contradictory and ambiguous decisions about who should succeed him. He distrusted everyone. He had briefly reinstated Deng Xiaoping, the pragmatist, who had been purged twice as a revisionist, only to purge him again under the gang's pressure. For the crucial position of premier, Mao chose neither a radical nor a pragmatic veteran. He chose Hua Guofeng, a provincial bureaucrat with a reputation for absolute loyalty and a surprising absence of his own power base. The choice of Hua came with a cryptic note from Mao: "With you in charge, I am at ease." This phrase would prove crucial in the events that followed. The Gang of Four interpreted Hua's appointment as a victory. They saw him as a weak man, easily manipulated. Immediately after Mao's death, the gang moved with an audacity that would become their undoing. They seized control of the media and the party's central archives. Jiang attempted to arrogate the title of party chairman, claiming to be the sole custodian of Mao's true thinking. Wang Hongwen, meanwhile, concentrated his attention on securing total control of the urban militias in Shanghai, where he commanded a private army of more than 1 million men, ready to be mobilized if the party's old guard attempted a maneuver against them. But the gang made a catastrophic miscalculation. They completely underestimated Hua Guofeng, and more importantly, they underestimated the absolute exhaustion the old guard of the party felt after a decade of revolutionary chaos. Behind the facade of loyalty to Mao, the key generals of the People's Liberation Army were done. Marshal Ye Jianying, a veteran with deep ties throughout the military, did not see the Gang of Four as legitimate successors. He saw them as a disease that had to be excised to save China from civil war. And here comes the most surprising element. Hua Guofeng, the supposed weak puppet, also had his own ambitions. Although he lacked Mao's charisma or Deng's experience, he possessed two crucial advantages: direct control of the state security apparatus and Mao's official blessing, that cryptic note giving him legitimacy as successor. The shift in the tide was silent. It was forged in absolute secrecy, far from the propaganda halls controlled by Yao Wenyuan. Ye Jianying and Hua Guofeng formed an uncomfortable alliance with a singular purpose: finish the radicalism before it could consolidate control over the army and central bureaucracy. The debate was not ideological, it was existential. For the conspirators, the continuation of the gang's power meant a China sunk in an infinite cycle of purges and struggles, a direct threat to the party's stability and to their own lives. They understood that in Chinese communism of that era, inaction was the fastest form of political suicide. The decision was made. It had to be fast, decisive, before the radicals could mobilize their militias or publish a new revolutionary edict. The action plan was designed with military precision. Marshal Ye ensured that the Beijing garrison units, the only troops that truly mattered at that moment, were under strict control and loyal to Hua. In parallel, Hua used his official position to issue security orders that, ostensibly protecting the capital after Mao's death, actually served to isolate and disarm those loyal to the gang. The conspirators understood that arresting all four simultaneously was essential. If one escaped or managed to raise the alarm, Shanghai's militias could mobilize and unleash a civil war. The trap closed the night of October 6, 1976, exactly 27 days after the death of Mao. Each of the four members was summoned separately, under different pretexts, to ensure none of them suspected anything until the last moment. Wang Hongwen, as described at the start, was called to Reading Room 119 under the pretext of a meeting about publishing the complete works of Mao. When he crossed the threshold of the room, he saw the severe faces of Hua Guofeng's personal guards. There was no debate, no negotiation, only the brutal, cold efficiency of the state machine turning on itself. The historical narrative suggests Wang attempted brief physical resistance, an instinctive reflex from the militia leader he had been. But he was surrounded and outnumbered by Central Security Bureau guards. The force used to subdue him was decisive and fast. Wang, the man who 1 year earlier had been hailed as Mao's successor, was handcuffed and stripped of his ceremonial uniform. Jiang was detained at her Zhongnanhai residence. Upon being informed she was under investigation, she reacted with a mixture of indignation and astonishment. She was incapable of conceiving that the party she and her husband had forged could turn against her. Jiang Chunqiao was summoned to the same fictitious meeting as Wang. Known for his calculating intellect, Jiang seemed to understand instantly that the game was over the moment he saw the guards' faces. He offered no resistance. His coldness in defeat was characteristic of his entire personality. The last to fall was Yao Wenyuan, detained at the Central Broadcasting Office, the headquarters of his media influence. In a moment of perfect irony, the man who had controlled every word published in China for a decade found himself incapable of uttering a single word to ask for help or justify his cause. In less than 2 hours, the totality of the Gang of Four, the faction that had terrorized China and controlled the country's narrative for 10 years, was neutralized. The absence of bloodshed in the capital allowed Hua and Ye to present the act not as a military coup, but as the execution of the party's and the people's will to save the revolution from counter-revolutionary elements. But the arrest was only the prologue. Now came the darkest part, the psychological destruction and the historical erasure. Once detained, the four were taken to Qincheng prison, maximum security facilities on the outskirts of Beijing, reserved exclusively for fallen high-ranking officials. These prisons had been built with Soviet assistance and designed specifically for total isolation. The treatment dispensed to the prisoners was designed to break their will and extract confessions that would legitimize the coup. Within the Chinese political context, the objective of the interrogation was not to discover the truth. It was to forge a truth the party could present to the public. Sleep deprivation, prolonged isolation, and constant sessions of forced criticism and self-criticism. These were methods Mao himself had perfected to break his ideological adversaries. Wang Hongwen, the youngest and least ideologically hardened of the group, was subjected to particular pressure. The interrogators exploited his working-class origins against him. They reproached him for the bourgeois lifestyle he had adopted upon ascending to power. They forced him to confront the evidence of his rapid escalation, presenting it as corrupt and opportunistic. The objective was to break the young rebel and strip him of the mantle of revolutionary purity Mao had granted him. Jiang Qing proved the most resistant, using her marital connection to Mao as a shield, attacking her interrogators with ideological diatribes, refusing to recognize Hua Guofeng's authority. Zhang Chunqiao sank into almost absolute silence, refusing to answer questions or sign documents. Yao Wenyuan was the first to yield to the pressure, providing politically useful information while avoiding direct self-incrimination. The psychological pressure was relentless. They were forced to listen to recordings of mass public criticism sessions the party organized, where millions of people chanted slogans calling them counter-revolutionaries and traitors. For people whose power resided in the control of public perception, this instant erasure was devastating. From 1976 to 1980, the four remained in conditions of total isolation. The outside world continued without them. China began to change dramatically under Deng Xiaoping's leadership. The country was opening economically, abandoning ideological excess, desperately seeking stability and development. The trial against the Gang of Four finally took place between 1980 and 1981. It was not a judicial process by any Western standard. It was a giant political theater designed to officially mark the end of the radical Maoist era and consolidate Deng's power. The trial was held in the Special Tribunal of the Supreme People's Court. The charges were broad: crimes against the state, conspiracy to overthrow the government, persecution of party cadres, and directing campaigns that caused the deaths and suffering of countless people during the Cultural Revolution. The irony was painful. Many of the accusers had themselves been victims of the gang's purges, but the legal framework used was the same autocratic system that had permitted the atrocities in the first place. The defendants were separated from their state-appointed lawyers, who acted more as assistants than as defenders. The difference in presentation among the four was notable. Jiang Qing, dressed in her characteristic military uniform, was the only one who defended herself vigorously. She transformed the witness stand into a platform to defend her late husband's ideology. In a dramatic moment that resonated through the international press, she screamed, "I was Mao's dog. Whoever he told me to bite, I bit." This cry, a mixture of pride, defiance, and final madness, sealed her fate. It revealed the terminal irony. She had been the most loyal executor of the tyranny, and for that very loyalty, the party was going to erase her. Wang Hongwen was a completely different figure. After 4 years of isolation and pressure, the once vibrant leader appeared gaunt, his spirit visibly broken. Unlike Zhang Qing and Zhang Chunqiao, Wang read a prepared confession in which he admitted having committed serious errors and accepted guilt for the imputed crimes. His submission was a triumph for the party's new leadership. It demonstrated that even the heir chosen by Mao had recognized the rectitude of the new political line. His confession condemned him to perpetual political darkness. The verdict came in January 1981. Zhang Qing and Zhang Chunqiao received suspended death sentences, which in practice meant life imprisonment. Yao Wenyuan and Wang Hongwen received extended prison sentences. Wang was sentenced to life. Beyond the individual sentences, the trial fulfilled its fundamental strategic purpose. The Communist Party officially decreed that responsibility for the 10 years of chaos of the Cultural Revolution rested solely on the counter-revolutionary clique of the Four, and not on Mao Zedong, whose figure had to remain venerated as the nation's founding father, nor on the party itself. It was an act of political alchemy, a national disaster transformed into the treachery of a few. For Wang Hongwen, the life sentence meant an existence of absolute confinement. He was transferred back to Qincheng prison. This was not a labor camp, but a fortress designed for total isolation. Prisoners were watched 24 hours a day, deprived of interaction with other inmates or staff beyond strictly necessary guards. The treatment at Qincheng after the trial was methodical. The objective was no longer to obtain confessions. It was to guarantee forgetting. For Wang, this existence became existential torture. A man who had thrived on agitation, the clamor of the masses and the adrenaline of power, confined to a monotonous routine of total silence. At first, Wang attempted to maintain a semblance of defiance. Over time, he fell into a deep state of depression. He spent his days reading and performing light manual work, but the most devastating thing was the total erasure of his name from the press and from public life. The outside world continued without him. Deng's China shot toward economic growth, actively forgetting the young revolutionary who had tried to keep the flame of class struggle alive. Wang Hongwen died in prison on August 3, 1992. He was 57 years old. The official cause was liver disease. His death was announced by Xinhua with a few dry lines confirming the death of the former counter-revolutionary leader. Without ceremony, without detail, his death was not an event. It was the closing of a file. With the Gang of Four condemned and silenced, the Chinese Communist Party dedicated itself to an exhaustive campaign of memory elimination. This process was executed with the same meticulousness with which Soviet artists had once retouched Stalin's photographs to remove fallen comrades. Immediately after the coup and the subsequent conviction, the propaganda apparatus received orders to eradicate any positive or neutral reference to Wang Hongwen and his co-accused. Photographs of Wang smiling alongside Mao were removed from public archives. Propaganda posters presenting him as the youthful leader of the proletariat were destroyed. Textbooks and internal party documents were rewritten to present the Four as an ideological cancer, a malevolent conspiracy that had hijacked the noble purpose of Mao's Cultural Revolution. This erasure went beyond censorship. It was a rewriting of the national timeline. The Cultural Revolution, which had been Mao's personal project, was formally characterized as a decade of catastrophe caused by the Gang of Four. This maneuver successfully deflected criticism away from Mao himself and consolidated the argument that the party was essentially good but had been temporarily manipulated by these malignant elements. Wang Hongwen, Mao's example of working-class purity, was redefined as an ambitious opportunist without loyalty. Because he had left no complex ideological writings, the elimination of his legacy focused on the disappearance of his visual presence and the denial of his political assent. His name was turned into a synonym for betrayal. For years, any mention of his name in China had to be accompanied by the epithet counter-revolutionary clique, ensuring his memory was permanently tainted. Even after his death in 1992, the silence was maintained. There are no monuments, no official biographies, not even a publicly accessible grave for him or his companions. The system guaranteed that future generations would know the Gang of Four only as a footnote about villains who attempted to destroy the nation's stability. This exercise of historical erasure is essential to understanding how autocracies function. power resides not only in the capacity to kill or imprison, it resides in the authority to determine which fragments of history must survive and which must perish. By making Wang Hongwen disappear, China did not just condemn a man. It eliminated an entire version of the revolution, a version too radical and too uncomfortable for the new era of economic pragmatism. The figure of Wang Hongwen and the Gang of Four remains a delicate subject in contemporary China, addressed only under the strict official narrative. But for historians and political analysts, their fall offers crucial lessons about the dynamics of power within a totalitarian system. The official Chinese historical verdict is that Wang was guilty of conspiracy and of crimes during the Cultural Revolution, but a more critical view demands recognizing the irony of his fate. Wang was the most faithful executor of Mao's extremist vision. His guilt was being the last one standing, defending a cause the rest of the party had decided to abandon. The crimes of the Cultural Revolution are undeniable, and Wang had active participation in the propagation of terror. Yet the 1981 trial was a political convenience. It did not seek to deliver justice for the victims. It sought to redistribute blame. By condemning Wang and his companions, the party preserved Mao's image as a leader who had simply made errors in his final years. Wang Hongwen is a case study in the volatility of loyalty. He represented the belief that proximity to the supreme leader guarantees immunity. His fall in just 27 days is a somber warning. Personal power is fleeting. Survival is based on circumstantial alliances and the capacity to pivot ideologically. When Mao died, Wang's source of legitimacy was exhausted. He had failed to build an independent power base in the military or among the bureaucrats, trusting too completely in the blessing of a dying man. In the end, Wang Hongwen was more than a criminal. He was a victim of the same purge machinery he had helped to build. His ambition elevated him, but his inability to recognize when the political wind had shifted precipitated him into a death in prison obscurity. His life and tragic end encapsulate the brutal maxim of the Great Purge politics. No one is too powerful to fall, and today's loyalty is tomorrow's betrayal. Wang Hongwen was the man China wanted to erase in order to forget its own errors. But history is not a painting that can be retouched. It is an archive full of scars that remind us that absolute power always ends by devouring its own children. The night of October 6, 1976, was not just the end of 4 people. It was the end of an era, the brutal closure of the permanent revolutionary utopia, and the birth of the pragmatic, economically powerful China we know today. Mao's heirs were eliminated in 27 days, but their story remains a valid warning about the dangers of absolute power and the fragility of political loyalty. Remembering these names, remembering how the state machinery operates for betrayal and oblivion, is the only way to understand how totalitarian regimes perpetuate themselves, how they rewrite history, and how they turn their own heroes into villains when they no longer serve them. Was Wang Hongwen genuinely a traitor to the revolution, or simply the last loyal man in a room full of people who had already decided to change direction? Leave your answer in the comments. History, as always, does not have a single answer.